Have you ever walked away from a conversation, not because you were defeated, but because you had nothing left to prove? Have you ever stayed silent, not because you lacked words, but because you finally understood they weren't worth saying? There's a kind of power that doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it doesn't fight for attention, it just watches, observes, waits, holds. That power is silence. And in a world addicted to noise, silence is often mistaken for weakness. But what if silence isn't weakness at all? What if silence is what real strength looks like after the ego has stepped aside? In this video, we explore a hidden truth that most people never see, that silence isn't the absence of a response. It is the response. That when used with awareness, silence becomes your sharpest boundary, your deepest protection, and your clearest mirror to the world. Inspired by Carl Jung's ideas of the shadow and the discipline of self-restraint, we'll explore why silence is not passive, but active, not a surrender, but a strategy, and why mastering silence is not about withholding your voice, but about reclaiming your energy. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. There comes a point in your life where you realize that not everything deserves your voice. Not every accusation demands a defense. Not every insult needs a comeback. Not every misunderstanding requires explanation. There comes a moment when you stop playing the game and start protecting your peace. And in that moment, you begin to understand silence is not empty. Silence is full. Full of power. Full of clarity. Full of restraint. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not a weakness, it is a form of inner mastery. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But here's the deeper truth. He never needed to say out loud to understand ourselves. We must first become quiet enough to hear what's happening beneath the surface. And that's where silence begins, not as a weapon, not as a manipulation, but as awareness. Because before you can silence the world, you must learn to silence the war within. Most people speak out of fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of losing control. Fear of being disrespected. And so they respond not to communicate, but to protect their ego. They defend, argue, over-explain, and in doing so leak energy into conflicts that lead nowhere. But silence. Silence is for those who no longer need to prove they're right. Silence is the space you give yourself when you've outgrown reactive living. It's what happens when you no longer trade your peace for participation. To be silent doesn't mean to suppress, it means to master. It means you have full access to your emotions, but you're no longer a slave to them. It means you can feel anger without becoming aggressive, disappointment without collapsing, provocation without reacting. That's not emotional suppression. That's emotional sovereignty. And emotional sovereignty is the soil where personal power grows. Silence is restraint, but not repression. It is presence, but not passivity. It is strength, but not domination. It's the quiet recognition that energy is currency, and where you spend it matters. Because not every battle is worthy of your spirit. Not every voice is worthy of your attention. Not every confrontation is worthy of your time. Most of the noise in this world is bait. Emotional bait. Ego bait. Shadow bait. It's designed to hook the part of you that still wants to be seen, to be right, to be validated. But here's what Jung taught us about the shadow: it feeds on unawareness. When you're unaware of your emotional triggers, you respond from a place of wounding, not wisdom. You react out of old programming, not present power. But when you become aware of your shadow, when you name it, own it, and sit with it, you no longer need to defend it. You become bigger than it. And in that bigness, silence becomes your natural response to small provocations. Because silence doesn't mean you're afraid. It means you're clear. It means you've already answered the most important question. Is this worth my energy? And if the answer is no, you let it pass. Like wind through trees, like thunder in the distance, like background noise that no longer deserves front-row access to your attention. You don't fight it. You don't run from it. You simply remain still. That stillness is a force field, a filter. It shows you who's projecting and who's truly connecting. Because when you stop giving your reactions away, you start seeing people for who they really are. Some will grow uncomfortable with your silence because they were never speaking to connect, only to control. Some will try harder to provoke you because your silence confronts them with themselves. But some will finally hear you, not through your words, but through your calm, through your energy, through your refusal to participate in chaos. And that's the real power of silence. It doesn't shout to be heard. It invites the world to listen more deeply. Silence does more than protect your energy. It sharpens your perception. Because when you're not busy defending, you're observing. You see how people speak when they're not being interrupted. You notice the inconsistencies in their words, the way their body shifts when they lie, the patterns in their aggression, the fear behind their anger, the need behind their criticism. Silence turns your awareness into a mirror, and in that mirror, the truth reflects itself. When you choose not to speak, you give yourself the gift of insight. You see the game before the board is even set. You feel the undercurrents in a conversation long before anything is said. And perhaps most importantly, you learn to hear the voices inside of you, the ones you usually drown out with noise. The voice of your intuition, the voice of your shadow, the voice of your higher self. Silence becomes a conversation with your soul, and in that sacred space, clarity is born. Carl Jung believed that the path to wholeness required us to face our shadow, not reject it, not destroy it, but integrate it. And silence is one of the most powerful ways we begin that integration. Because your shadow is not loud, it is subtle. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't demand attention, it waits for you in stillness. And if you are constantly busy reacting, performing, arguing, you never get quiet enough to hear what it's trying to say. The moment you choose silence over reaction, you're not just avoiding drama. You're stepping out of old patterns. You're no longer feeding the part of yourself that needs chaos to feel alive. You're no longer trying to win meaningless battles just to protect a false identity. You're no longer addicted to being right. You are finally free, not just from others, but from the version of yourself that used to chase validation at all costs. There's a quiet revolution happening inside of you. The part that used to interrupt is now listening. The part that used to control is now letting go. The part that used to prove is now at peace. And the part that used to fear being misunderstood is now rooted in self-understanding. Because here's the truth. Silence doesn't protect you from being misunderstood. It reveals who is committed to misunderstanding you. It shows you who only hears what they want to hear, who only sees the version of you that benefits them. And when you no longer try to fix that perception, you reclaim your dignity. You stop editing yourself just to be palatable. You stop arguing with people who are not seeking truth, only domination. You stop handing your wisdom to those who treat it like noise. And in that stillness, your presence begins to speak louder than your words ever could. You become the calm in the storm. You become the one who doesn't flinch. You become the mirror that reflects what others cannot face in themselves. And some will call you cold, distant, arrogant. Let them. Because the truth is, they are not used to someone who doesn't need to be loud to be strong. They are not used to someone who doesn't need to explain to be clear. They are not used to someone who doesn't need to fight to win. Silence is how the wise walk through chaos without becoming part of it. Not every battle is yours to fight. Not every disagreement is yours to resolve. And not every invitation to conflict is worth your RSVP. When you begin to see that most arguments are not about truth, but about control, you start choosing silence not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Silence is what separates the emotionally reactive from the emotionally intelligent. It is what allows you to rise above, not because you think you're better, but because you know you're no longer interested in being dragged into drama that robs you of your peace. Because drama is noisy. It thrives on urgency, on reactivity, on feeding the ego's endless hunger to be right. And once you see this pattern, you realize your silence is not just personal, it's spiritual. It's an act of rebellion against a world that rewards outrage and punishes stillness. It's a declaration that your energy is sacred, that your nervous system is not for sale, that your identity is not up for negotiation with anyone who seeks to pull you into emotional quicksand. And that's where true strength lies, not in your ability to dominate a room, but in your ability to not need to let others spin their web of assumptions and projections without getting caught in it, to let their noise pass through you like wind through branches, heard, felt, and released. But this strength doesn't happen by accident. It comes from practice, from moments where you could say something sharp but don't, where you could win the argument but walk away, where you could prove your point, but instead choose your peace. And every time you do that, you're building a new kind of muscle, the kind Carl Jung called individuation. The process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world demands you to be. Silence is essential to that process, because individuation requires space, reflection, disconnection from the noise of collective expectations. You cannot hear your soul's voice if you are constantly reacting to everyone else's. Silence is not withdrawal, it's alignment. It's not avoidance, it's discernment. It's not absence, it's presence in its highest form. There will be moments when your silence drives people mad, when your refusal to engage is seen as disrespect. But remember this: your silence is not meant to control how others feel. It's meant to protect who you are becoming. And who you are becoming does not owe everyone access. Your soul is not public property. And when you protect it with silence, you are making a statement far louder than words. I know who I am. I know what I value. And I don't need to trade my peace for your understanding. You are not here to win arguments. You are here to become whole. And wholeness requires silence. Silence to see the game. Silence to hear the truth. Silence to know what is yours to carry and what is not. Because so many of the battles we fight are not about justice. They're about identity. We argue because we feel threatened, because our shadow is poked, because our self-worth is still tied to being right. But when you have untied that knot, when your identity is no longer held hostage by the opinions of others, you will find silence more satisfying than any comeback ever could be. That's the shift from needing to win to choosing to walk away. Not because you're weak, but because your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth are now governed by a higher standard. You are no longer in the business of emotional labor for those who weaponize misunderstanding. You are no longer explaining your boundaries to people committed to violating them. You are no longer wasting breath on proving your worth to those who only listen to respond, not to understand. And in that silence, you are finally free. Silence doesn't just protect you, it reveals others. When you stop interrupting, when you stop defending, when you stop over-explaining, people start to show you exactly who they are. Without your noise in the equation, their true patterns begin to emerge. You see the manipulation behind the smile, the insecurity behind the aggression, the neediness behind the arrogance. And most importantly, you begin to notice who is speaking from the heart and who is speaking from their wounds. Carl Jung understood this deeply. Most of what people express on the surface is just a mask, the persona, a carefully constructed identity designed to hide their deeper fears, desires, and unresolved pain. But when you are silent, you're no longer engaging with the mask, you're studying what lies beneath it. You're not seduced by charm or intimidated by volume. You're attuned to subtext, to tone, to energy. You're no longer reacting, you're reading. And the more silent you become, the more you realize how much people say without saying anything at all. The way they look away when asked a hard question. The way they dominate a conversation to avoid being asked one. The way they joke to deflect pain. The way they accuse when they feel seen. Silence turns you into a listener of the unsaid, and in that stillness, your intuition sharpens. But this kind of perception doesn't come from being passive. It comes from being present. From listening, not just with your ears, but with your whole nervous system. You feel when something's off. You sense when a smile is hiding sorrow. You notice the crack in the voice that betrays confidence. You hear the shadow behind the words. And that is power. Because when you can read people at that level, you don't need to control them. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to expose them. You simply understand them. And from that understanding, you choose, do I engage or do I walk away? Silence gives you that power of choice. Because when you speak too quickly, you give away your energy before you've fully understood the situation. But when you wait, when you sit with it, when you let silence do its work, you begin to see clearly. And when you see clearly, your next move is no longer reactive. It's intentional. This is where emotional maturity begins, when you stop seeking to win interactions and instead seek to understand what they're here to teach you. Some conversations are not here to be resolved. They're here to reveal. Some people are not in your life to love you. They're in your life to awaken you. And some conflicts are not battles. They're mirrors. But to recognize these things, you must be still. You must be quiet. You must stop filling the space with noise just to avoid discomfort. Because your discomfort often holds the greatest wisdom. Your silence is not a void, it is a vessel. It holds truth until you are ready to receive it. And here's the most important truth that silence reveals. Not everything that comes toward you deserves a response. That accusation, let it go unanswered. That guilt trip, let it land in silence. That passive aggression, let it echo into the void. Because your silence is not compliance, it's clarity. You are no longer fighting to be seen. You are now choosing when and where to be visible. You are no longer reacting to every emotional invitation. You are now filtering them through a higher lens. A lens of discernment. A lens of protection. A lens of energetic integrity. And in that silence, something powerful happens. You begin to hear yourself again. Your thoughts slow down. Your heartbeat regulates. Your mind stops spinning defensive strategies and starts listening inwardly. You reconnect with what you feel, not just what you're expected to feel. And that's where true alignment begins, not in words, but in stillness. Because only in stillness can you ask the real questions. What am I actually feeling right now? What part of me is being triggered? Is this my pain, or theirs projected onto me? Is this moment a threat, or just my shadow feeling exposed? These are questions the noisy world cannot answer. Only your silence can. There is a quiet kind of healing that happens when you choose silence, not because you're afraid to speak, but because you've finally realized you no longer need to. You've matured beyond the need to be understood by those who cannot hear you. You've stopped performing for people who never knew how to hold space for your truth, and you've stopped trying to win arguments that have no reward except ego inflation. Silence at this point is no longer just a reaction, it's a form of liberation. This is what Carl Jung hinted at in his work on the ego and the shadow. The ego craves attention. It wants to be seen, acknowledged, validated. The shadow, when unintegrated, manipulates the ego into thinking that survival depends on being right, being liked, being powerful in the eyes of others. But when you integrate your shadow, when you recognize your own insecurities, your need for validation, your hunger to be heard, and meet them with compassion rather than control, something changes. You no longer need to speak to feel strong, because now strength comes from restraint. Strength comes from self-trust. Strength comes from knowing that your truth doesn't need applause to be real. And the ones who truly carry that strength, they rarely raise their voice, not because they lack the capacity, but because they've already won the war inside themselves. They've looked their own demons in the eye and made peace. They've stopped projecting their wounds onto the world. They've stopped needing to win every verbal exchange just to feel whole. And that is why their silence carries more weight than someone else's scream. There is nothing louder than a grounded presence. When someone sits in their truth without needing to convince you, pay attention. That's not arrogance. That's alignment. That's what happens when a person has done the inner work of confronting the ego and making peace with not being understood. They are no longer in the emotional marketplace trading identity for approval. They have exited that system entirely, and their silence is their proof. You feel it when they walk into a room. You feel it when they choose not to respond. You feel it when they let others talk in circles and they just sit, knowing, not above, not detached, just anchored. That kind of silence comes from having nothing to prove, and nothing to prove is the most powerful position you can be in. Because once you stop proving, you start choosing. Choosing your battles, choosing your energy, choosing your words not out of impulse, but out of intention. And every time you choose silence over reaction, you're strengthening the foundation of your inner life. You're no longer letting others pull you into their chaos. You're no longer mistaking volume for truth. You're no longer addicted to being seen. You're simply centered. And from that center, something sacred begins to grow. A deeper kind of listening, a fuller kind of presence, a slower, richer relationship with yourself and the world around you. The kind of relationship that doesn't rely on noise to feel real. It simply exists because it is grounded in truth. And here's the paradox: the more silent you become, the more clearly others hear who you really are. Not because you told them, but because your energy, calm, still, and unwavering, speaks the language of integrity. And integrity is unmistakable. It needs no translation. It is felt, not heard. So when you choose silence, you're not disappearing. You're crystallizing. You're no longer trying to be everywhere, to be everything, to be heard by everyone. You're anchoring yourself in the rarest kind of power, the power to exist as you are, whether or not the world responds. Because true power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't chase. It simply is. And when you understand that, you will never need to raise your voice again. Silence is not retreat. It is return. Return to self. Return to center. Return to that place within you that doesn't rely on the world to tell you who you are. When you become silent, not in fear, but in fullness, you begin to sense your own value, independent of performance. You no longer need to speak, to justify. No longer need to explain to be valid. No longer need to be loud to be real. You simply exist in your worth, and let that be enough. And that's the shift the world isn't ready for, because the world profits from your reactivity. Social media thrives on your outrage. Institutions count on your insecurity. Unconscious people feed on your emotional availability. But when you choose silence, you interrupt the transaction. You stop giving what they never earned. You stop feeding systems that exploit your attention. And in that refusal, you reclaim your soul. You are not here to convince anyone of your value. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are not here to participate in every fight that calls your name. You are here to remember that your presence, your boundaries, and your peace are not up for negotiation. And silence is how you remember, because silence is the ultimate boundary. It is the invisible wall that protects your energy without explanation. It is the firm no that requires no sentence. It is the refusal to lower your vibration just to match someone else's chaos. It is the discipline of letting things pass through you without owning them, and the maturity to know the difference between reaction and response. Silence says, I see what's happening, and I choose not to join it. Silence says, I feel the invitation to engage, and I respectfully decline. Silence says, I know my truth, and I don't need your agreement to keep it. And in that silence, you build a new reality, one where your value is not conditional, one where your peace is not performative, one where you are not reduced to a role, but expanded into a full being, whole, awake, free. You begin to notice how light your life becomes when you stop carrying the need to be right. How clear your thoughts are when you stop rehearsing comebacks to people who don't matter. How strong your boundaries feel when you let silence do the work of separation. And how beautifully your energy returns to you when you stop scattering it to be understood. Because here's the truth you were never told. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to be seen to be valid. You don't need to be chosen to be whole. You only need to be loyal to yourself. And silence is one of the deepest forms of self-loyalty. When the world demands noise, choose clarity. When the world demands reaction, choose groundedness. When the world demands your energy, choose silence. Not to disappear, but to deepen. Because when you choose silence, you are no longer trying to escape the world. You are choosing to move through it, on your terms, with your pace, from your power. And one day, without warning, you'll find yourself in a situation that would have once broken you. Someone will insult you, betray you, misunderstand you, call your name, test your patience, and you'll just stand there, not cold, not passive, but completely anchored, calm, aware, silent. And in that moment, you'll realize you are no longer who you used to be. You are no longer reachable in the ways that once kept you small. You are no longer performing for love that was never real. You are simply here, whole, clear, silent. And that silence, it says everything. Silence. It unsettles them. It destabilizes the game they were playing. Because what they expected was a reaction, and what you gave them was presence. You stayed rooted. You stayed composed. And in that moment, you taught them something They'll never forget you are no longer available for emotional bait. Now imagine you're with family, a parent maybe who always guilt trips you. You never call. You don't care. You only think about yourself. In the past, you would have explained, apologized, gotten pulled into the emotional loop. But this time, you sit with the words. You feel the pull, but you don't move. Because you know that guilt is not love, and silence is not disrespect. It's protection. You let the discomfort hang in the air. You don't fill it. You don't fix it. You let them sit with their projection. And in doing so, you reclaim your boundary, not with a wall, but with stillness. This is the real-world application of silence. Not escape, not evasion, but energetic alignment, emotional discipline, inner maturity. Because sometimes the strongest statement is no statement at all. But here's the part. No one talks about when you become silent. In this way, it shifts the dynamics around you. People who are used to dominating conversations will feel exposed. People who relied on your emotional reactions to control you will lose their leverage. People who confused your kindness with compliance will have to reevaluate who they're dealing with. And yes, some of them will leave. Let them. Your silence does not push people away. It reveals who was only there to feed on your noise. Your silence doesn't destroy relationships. It purifies them. What remains after silence is what was real all along. In romantic relationships, this becomes even more powerful. The partner who once relied on your over-explaining, your over-giving, your emotional availability, now faces the reality of your sovereignty. You don't engage in every disagreement. You don't play out the same arguments just to feel heard. You don't fix what isn't yours to fix. You choose peace over performance. And that choice either deepens the relationship or exposes its weakness. Silence makes things clear. Not fast, but clear. Because truth doesn't always arrive in words. Sometimes it arrives in space, in pause, in breath, in the sacred in-between where nothing is said, but everything is known. And here's the ultimate truth you begin to understand. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that performs for approval. You don't owe anyone your exhaustion in exchange for belonging. You don't owe anyone constant access to your energy. What you do owe above all else is your loyalty to your own clarity. And silence creates that clarity. Not because silence is always right, but because silence always gives you the chance to respond from consciousness, not compulsion. It's the space between impulse and intention. It's the difference between saying what feels good now and saying what is true later. And sometimes silence is the only thing that protects what's sacred. Because once you speak, the energy moves, the spell breaks, the intimacy is altered. But when you hold silence, when you let it expand, even in tension, you allow something deeper to emerge. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's insight. Sometimes it's the realization that you no longer care to win. You only care to stay free. And freedom sounds like this. No more defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. No more explaining your feelings to people who weaponize them. No more giving your voice to battles you've already outgrown. Freedom sounds like breathing, like stillness, like silence. So the next time someone comes at you with judgment, manipulation, projection, or chaos, don't reach for your best argument. Don't prepare your cleverest comeback. Don't match their intensity just to prove you can. Pause, breathe, observe, and if needed, say nothing. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not respond, not out of fear, not out of pride, but out of deep knowing that the person you've become no longer needs to speak to be heard, no longer needs to react to feel worthy, no longer needs to win to be free. You've outgrown the noise, and now you are becoming the silence. So if no one told you this yet, let me say it now. You are allowed to walk away in silence. You are allowed to protect your peace without explanation. You are allowed to speak only when your soul is ready, not your ego, because your silence is not absence. It is presence. It is power. It is clarity. And sometimes it is the loudest thing you will ever say.